Hello my friends, I am back and we are going to keep reading The Green Glass Sea. The last time we read the really long chapter 1 and we met Dewey Kerrigan and her father, and she traveled all the way from St. Louis to New Mexico where her father is working for the army doing something secret that we don't get to know about yet. So that chapter took place in November of 1943, but now we are jumping ahead to 1944. And it's going to be August 25th. So we're kind of jumping pretty far ahead in time, almost a year, but not quite. So, Chapter 2, August 25th, Jumping Rope. Terry Gordon sat at the kitchen table staring at the cards in her hand. She took a puff of her cigarette, then discarded the 7 of clubs. Her daughter Suze looked at it, shook her head, and drew a card from the pile. A queen. She needed an 8. She made a face and tossed the queen onto the discard pile. "Ha," said her mother. "Gin." She tossed the cards onto the table in groups of 3 and 4 and smiled triumphantly. Suze laid her cards down with a sigh. So close. She'd only needed 1 card to go out herself. She counted up her unmatched cards. 6, 11, 20, she said. Her mother picked up the pencil and scribbled the total onto their score pad. "Okay, that gives me 25,658 to your," she looked at the other column of numbers, 22,485. She glanced at the clock, then stubbed her Chesterfield out in the glass ashtray. "That's it for today, sweetie," she said. "I've got to run. Remember to tell Daddy that I'll try and meet you in the lodge for dinner." She put her coffee cup in the sink, blew a kiss from her fingertips, opened the screen door, and ran lightly down the outside staircase that led from their second-floor apartment to the road below. Her moccasins made soft thuds on each riser, and then she was gone, as usual. Suze looked at the ivory plastic clock on the kitchen wall. 5 minutes to 1. She put her fingers in her ears and waited. A few seconds later, at exactly 12:55, a shrill siren sounded its warning blast, signaling the end of the lunch hour. Suze counted to 10, then took her fingers out of her ears. It would go off again in another 5 minutes. By then, her mother would be back at the tech area gate and back in her lab, doing whatever she did with her chemicals 6 days a week. Daddy, too, in his own lab. He hadn't come home for lunch, the 3rd time this week. She hoped he'd remember to stop for dinner. Suze sighed and pushed her blonde hair back behind her ears. It was getting to be an annoying length. Too long to be short, its blunt bowl cut meant that the sides were always falling in her face. Her mother had trimmed the bangs with nail scissors last week, but she needed a real haircut, and that meant a trip to Santa Fe, or to the army barber, which was starting to feel like a reasonable solution to Suze. She could walk there by herself. She pushed the score pad and pencil to the corner of the table. The numbers were written in pencil, pen, all different colors of ink, because the game had started more than a year ago. They used to play every night after dinner, but lately her mother had been too busy. This was their first game in 2 weeks. Both her parents had always worked. Back in Berkeley, though, where they'd been professors at the university, they'd had regular hours. Here on the hill, she was never sure when she would see them, especially Mom. Suze missed having her around, which was unpatriotic, because whatever the scientists were working on was going to end the war, and she knew that was more important than playing cards. Most days. The second siren went off, startling her. She'd forgotten. "Do you ever miss our old life?" she asked her cat, Rutherford, who was lounging by the kitchen door. He was a big, orange-striped Tom who didn't seem to notice any different between one sunny floor and another. California sun, New Mexico sun, it didn't much matter to Rutherford. But it did to Suze. She'd spent her entire life up until last fall in a rambling old house on Russell Street, half a mile from the UC campus, only a block from College Avenue, with a movie theater and 2 drugstores. There were never any sirens unless there was a fire, and they'd had a yard with grass and trees with leaves. Not like here. Here, they lived upstairs in a tiny apartment with only 4 rooms. In the summer, it was hot outside and dust blew in, making the wooden floors gritty. In the winter, it was too hot inside, and soot from the coal furnace coated the walls and tabletops with a greasy black film. The walls were so thin, they could hear the family next door talking in their living room when she was trying to fall asleep. She had her own room, but it was just barely big enough to hold her bed and desk and dresser. If she stuck her head way, way out the window, she could see the mountains and pine trees and the rocky slopes of the canyon, and about 1,000,000 stars at night. That part was okay. Mostly, though, when she looked out the window normally, all she saw was laundry and dirt and army green everything. Greenhouses, green trucks, green uniforms. Suze liked colors. She liked crayons and paints and Oz books full of pictures of the Emerald City, but she was getting very tired of the Army's kind of green. She put her plate and milk glass in the sink and thought about writing a letter to her grandmother. She'd gotten one last week, a late birthday card, so she ought to write back, except she wasn't allowed to say anything interesting. She wasn't allowed to talk about the people here or what happened last week or even where she was. She had to leave the envelope open, too, so the censors could read her letter before it left the hill. Suze hated having some old army man read her private thoughts. Once she had drawn a picture for Grandma Weiss, the view from her bedroom, the stick your head out view, which had been very hard to draw. But the stupid old censor sent it back and said it wasn't allowed. If she couldn't talk about where she lived or anything, what was the point of writing a letter? Through the open kitchen window, she heard voices from the road below, so she walked out onto the tiny porch they shared with the neighbors, letting the screen door bang behind her. A small knot of kids was down by the garbage cans at the bottom of the stairs. Back home, the street was at the fronts of the houses, but here it was at the backs. The army built it that way, her father said, because making deliveries would be easier. Her mother said it made the place look like a slum. "What are you doing?" Suze called down. "Nothing much," a boy named Tom answered. He tossed a stone a few feet, raising a tiny mushroom of dust in the dirt road. They always played in the street. There weren't any lawns or yards or sidewalks, and no traffic during the day, except for an occasional army truck. And you could hear those coming from a long way away, bouncing and clattering over the rutted dirt roads that crisscrossed the site. She thought for a moment. Doing nothing with the other kids might be more fun than doing it by herself. She pounded down the back steps 2 at a time. Suze Gordon was a stocky child with cinnamon brown eyes, dressed in a striped shirt and cut-off khaki pants, the edges of the legs jagged and raveling. She had just turned 11 and was as tall as most of the boys in her class, taller than some of them. She hoped she could talk the other kids into playing Red Rover. She was a good runner and strong and could almost always break through. A blonde girl named Judy sat on the concrete stoop at the bottom of the stairs. She moved over to let Suze pass, but not enough to make room for her to sit. Judy was in her class at school, but she and Barbara and Betty and Joyce always hung out together, or with the other Girl Scouts. Thick as thieves, her mother said. Suze had been a brownie in 2nd grade, back in Berkeley. They'd gone on field trips to the zoo and made plaster casts of animal tracks up in Tilden Park, and even rode horses once. So when they moved to the Hill and her mother suggested she join the troop because it would be a good way to get her to know the other girls and give her something to do after school, Suze had agreed. She lasted 2 meetings. There weren't going to be any field trips because of security. In the first meeting, 2 whole hours, was Joyce's mother lecturing about rules and uniforms and requirements for badges. More rules? More green uniforms? Suze had enough of that with the Army. The next week, Joyce's mother's idea of fun turned out to be making plaques with the Girl Scout motto spelled out in macaroni letters, the kind that were supposed to be alphabet soup. And when Suze showed her mother the two-page typed list of Girl Scout do's and don'ts, even Mrs. Gordon made a face and said that life was too short. But Suze wondered sometimes if the other girls would ask her to play jacks or jump rope more if she'd stayed a Girl Scout, finished her plaque, learned the pledge, wore a white blouse, or would she just be in a uniform and still outside of their special circle? Because it wasn't just Girl Scouts, it was movie magazines and paper dolls of Dina Durbin in frothy pink dresses, and the lipstick Betty had gotten the time she went to Santa Fe, the one her mother could never find out about but wasn't it a dreamy color. Suze had gotten herself invited over to Judy's or Joyce's apartment a few times, and had tried to pretend she was interested in all that, but mostly she was bored. Did they really like that stuff? Suze just didn't get it. She leaned against the stair railing and listened as Joyce and Barbara twirled the jump rope and chanted the rhyme for Betty. V is for victory, ... Hitler lost his little mustache. If you find it, let him know, and he'll give you a bag of dough. How much money is in that bag? $1, $2, $3. Betty got all the way up to 27 before she missed, which Suze thought was pretty good. Suze wasn't good at jump rope. Her feet got tangled too fast. "I'm hot," said Betty, who was red in the face from jumping. "Let's take a break." The other girls nodded and went and sat on the other stoop, fanning themselves. "So, what are you doing?" Suze asked a crew-cut boy named Jack. He was leaning on the side of the stair rail, whittling pieces of wood into splinters with his pocket knife. She tried to sound casual, but it came out sounding like a line from a play. "Waiting for my brother Charlie. We're going to go work on our fort," he said, throwing away the last bit of wood. He folded his knife and put it in his pocket. "No girls allowed." Suze made a face. She tried to think of something snappy to say back, but came up blank. Then she got an idea. "I'm going to the PX for a Coke," she said in a loud voice, and looked across the other stoop. "The Tech PX." She held her breath, waiting for somebody to say what a swell idea that was, and maybe they'd come along, but they almost never did anything she said. Joyce looked up at her for a long second, long enough to make Suze feel uncomfortable, as if she were being judged, or Joyce was trying to figure out if there would be a better offer. "It is hot," Joyce said finally. "Barbara, Bets, you want to go get Cokes?" She made it sound like it was her idea, but Suze didn't say anything. "A cold Coke sounds nifty-heen," said Betty, sounding like one of her movie magazines, "but the Tech PX is awfully far." "We could stop at the pond," said Suze, and just then she got another idea that was even better. "Besides, I know a shortcut. Let me get my shoes." She turned and ran back up the stairs and grabbed her sneakers from where she dropped them on the porch the night before. Hardly any kids on the hill wore shoes in the summer, unless a grown-up said they had to, but her plan wasn't a barefoot idea. She looped the laces together, strung her shoes around her neck, and clattered down the stairs, quick, so they wouldn't leave without her. Joyce always wore shoes, and Betty had put hers on for jumping. "We have to stop so I can get mine," Barbara said. She lived in one of the houses over on Bathtub Row because her father was a big shot. He was a captain in the Navy, not the Army. Suze wasn't sure why he was here, since there wasn't any water for about 1,000 miles. The four girls walked down the middle of the road, with Betty and Joyce a little behind, giggling to each other. They headed south, the pine-studded canyon far over on their right. The road didn't have a name. None of them did. Suze thought this made it really hard to give anyone directions, but the Army didn't want people knowing much about the hill, even if you lived there. She had learned to navigate by landmarks, like Fuller Lodge, or the tall wooden water tower to the west of it, which was visible from almost everywhere. "Hi, Sergeant Walter," Barbara said to the military policeman who stood guard outside her house. He wore a black armband with the white letters MP. Barbara pointed to the pass safety pin to her blouse. "I'm just going in to get my shoes." The MP glanced at the pass. "Your mother's having a tea party. Mrs. Oppie and some of the other ladies," he said. "You might want to go in the back way." Barbara nodded. "Thanks, I could get stuck in there all afternoon." She made a face. "You have to wait here," she said to the other girls. "I'll be right back." Betty and Joyce sat down under a pine tree. Suze stood in the shade. They watched Sergeant Walter on his patrol, walking up to the Oppie's house, then back again. These 5 houses were sturdy, built of logs and stones, remnants of the old boys' school that used to be on the hill before the Army. The most important people on the hill lived here. Sergeant Walter walked up and back, up and back. He didn't pay any attention to them. "I'm glad my dad's not a big shot," said Suze, sucking on a pine needle. It tasted faintly like turpentine. What a pain to have to show a pass just to go home. Hers was in the top drawer of her dresser. She didn't need it unless she left the hill, to go down to Santa Fe, and that had only happened 3 times since they'd moved here. "Oh, but it would be so nice to live in a real house, with a bathtub," Joyce said, sighing. "But the guards are a little creepy. I guess it's okay, my daddy's just a fizzler." Her father was a physicist, but no one was supposed to talk about that, so people called them fizzlers. Chemists were stinkers. Suze's mother was a stinker. It was cooler under the tree, and they stayed there for a little while, even after Barbara came out of her house wearing her loafers. They watched Sergeant Walter make 3 trips up and down Bathtub Row. "I'm thirsty," said Betty, standing up after the MP had turned to go back down the road again. "And if we wait too long, the PX will be full of soldiers, and they'll ditch us out of line." They continued down the road. Chapter 3. Treasures at the Dump. Dewey took a final bite of her apple, and without taking her eyes off her book, put the core into the brown paper sack on the ground next to her. She was reading a biography, The Life of Faraday, and she was just about coming to the exciting part where he figured out about electricity and magnetism. She leaned contentedly against Papa's shoulder and turned the page. Today, they had chosen to sit against the west wall of the commissary for their picnic lunch. It offered a little bit of shade. They could look out at the pond, and it was 3 minutes from Papa's office, which meant they could spend almost the whole hour reading together. "Dews," Papa said a few minutes later, "remember the other night when we were talking about how much math and music are related?" Dewey nodded. "Well, there was a quote I couldn't quite recall, and I just found it. Listen." He began to read very slowly. "Music is the hidden arithmetic of the soul, which does not know that it deals with numbers. Music is the pleasure the human mind experiences from counting without being aware that it is counting." That's exactly what I was talking about. "Who said it?" Dewey asked. "Leibniz. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He was an interesting guy, a mathematician and a philosopher and a musician to boot. You'd like him. Can I borrow that book when you're done?" "I don't think you'd get far," he laughed. He turned and showed her his book, bound in very old brown leather that was flaking off in places. The page it was open to was covered in an odd, heavy black type. "It's in German," Dewey said, surprised. That explained why he had read so slowly. He'd been translating. "So is Leibniz a Nazi?" "Hardly. He died more than 200 years ago, long before there were any Nazis." He shook his head. "Don't make the mistake of throwing out a whole culture just because some madmen speak the same language. Remember, Beethoven was German, and Bach, and—" The rest of his sentence was interrupted by the shrill siren from the tech area. He sighed. "Time to go back to my own numbers." He closed his book, then leaned over and kissed Dewey on the top of her head. "What are you up to this afternoon?" He stood up, brushed the crumbs from his sandwich off his lap into the dirt, then brushed the dirt itself off the back of his pants. Dewey squinted up at him. "I think I'll sit here and read for a while. A couple more chapters anyway. Then I'm going to the dump. Some of the labs are moving into the Gamma building now that it's done, and people always throw out good stuff when they move." He smiled. "Looking for anything in particular?" I don't know yet. I need some bigger gears and some knobs and dials and some ball bearings, she added after a short pause. I'll show you at dinner if I find anything really special. Deal. We're just analyzing data this afternoon, so I may actually get out at 5:30. If you get home before me, put the casserole in the oven and we can eat around 7. He tucked his book under his arm. Okay. Dewey watched him walk around the corner of the building, then turned back to her book. 20 minutes later, she came to the end of the chapter and was tired of sitting on the hard-packed ground. She stood up and stretched, put her book into the red wagon parked a few feet away, and picked up its wooden handle. She had found the wagon at the dump at the beginning of the summer, a rusted former toy that was missing one wheel. Their neighbor, Mr. Sandoval, was a mechanic and had made her a replacement. It was the right size, but metal instead of rubber, and now the wagon rolled with an odd, lopsided syncopation on the rutted dirt roads. Still, it meant that she could bring home heavier things and carry them all in one trip. She walked down to the road that bordered the tech area, pulling the wagon behind her, leaving parallel trails in the dust. It was hot, and the wagon made walking a little awkward, but she was looking forward to seeing what might be in the dump. You never knew. Sometimes it was just lumber and wire-studded chunks of concrete, construction stuff. But other times there were machines with lots of wonderful tiny parts, or tools like the drill she found whose wooden handle was cracked a little, but worked just fine. Dewey whistled under her breath. She still marveled at the freedom she had on the hill. In St. Louis, Nana had only allowed her to walk to school and back, 4 blocks, and no dawdling because Nana knew just how long it took, so there was no chance for Dewey to go off exploring by herself. It wasn't safe, Nana said, but it was safe here. There were guards, so inside the fence she could go anywhere she wanted, anytime, even at night. She and Papa knew just about everyone who lived here, and no strangers could get in from outside. Her favorite thing was that no one ever told her she asked too many questions. In the 9 months she'd lived here, Dewey had explored almost every inch of the project, except for the parts that were secret and had extra guards. And everywhere she went, there were men just as smart as Papa, or just as clever, who would help her figure out how to fix a busted clock, or radio, or motor, take it apart, and explain how it worked. It was wrong to think, but sometimes she hoped the war would go on and on and on, so she and Papa could stay here forever. As she rounded the corner of the fence near the dump, she heard voices and stopped. The dump wasn't guarded. Anyone could come and take whatever they wanted, but she just wanted to rummage and didn't want to talk to anyone official. She peered around the corner of the fence and saw that it was just her friend Charlie and his little brother Jack. She'd been in Charlie's algebra class all spring, even though he was 13. Her 5th grade class had been doing fractions, and she'd been bored. She was used to that. But this time, the teacher had noticed, and after giving Dewey a little test to see what she knew, had asked her if she'd like to take math with the 8th grade, because it would be more of a challenge. So, she knew Charlie. Both brothers had reddish blonde crew cuts and freckles. Charlie was half a head taller, and he was wearing dungarees that ended 2 inches above his black high tops. Jack wore cutoffs ragged at the knees. Both boys had t-shirts that had started out white. They carried a long piece of lumber, dropping it into a pile by their bikes with a loud crack. As they turned to go back for another, Dewey pushed her wagon forward and waved. "Hey, Dewey," said Charlie. He pulled a bandana from his back pocket and mopped his reddening forehead. "Hey," said Dewey, "more wood for your treehouse?" The boys had been building a secret fortress somewhere in the woods all summer. Everyone knew about it, all the kids at least, but Dewey had never seen it. "Yeah, great stuff today. Look, shingles." Charlie pointed to a stack of sand-encrusted rectangular plates, the size and shape of books, but as thin as records, that lay in his wire bike basket. "It's the last of Morganville, and there's enough to cover our whole roof. Maybe now it won't leak when it rains." "That'll be good," agreed Dewey. She looked over at the wood bins, which were divided into pine, hardwood, and painted wood, each of them full to overflowing. "Is it just lumber today?" "Heck no," said Jack. "They must have moved a bunch of labs, because there's a ton of that busted-up machine junk you like. Over there." He pointed at the far fence, where a spiky jumble of steel and chrome glinted in the summer sun. Dewey grinned and took a pair of brown leather gloves from the wagon and put them in her pocket. The gloves were way too big for her hands and made sorting clumsy, but sometimes the machines were really busted and their edges were sharp, or there was broken glass. "What are you looking for?" asked Charlie, walking along beside her as they made their way to the scrap pile. "Something interesting. I don't know yet." The first thing she saw was 2 pieces of copper tubing, one as wide as a cigar, the other smaller. She tugged on them, and they came free easily. Each was about 2 feet long, which meant she'd have to cut them down with her hacksaw when she figured out what they were for. She laid them off to one side in the dirt. Her pile grew over the next few minutes as she added some polished metal discs as big around as coffee cups, an alarm clock with a broken-off key, and a gray metal box with 2 nice black Bakelite knobs. Her hands were gray from rummaging through metal parts, and she was sweaty. Just a few more minutes, then she'd call it a day and go home and start to dismantle what she'd found. She smiled at the alarm clock with anticipation. That was going to be fun. "Hey, look at this," said Charlie to her right. Dewey went over to look. It's a typewriter, she said excitedly. She tugged and pulled and pushed on the black steel frame until it came free and crashed to the ground, a small avalanche of metal cascading around it. Charlie looked down at it. The roller thing's missing. It won't work. I know. I just want the bell and the springs. And the keys are neat looking. I could probably do something with them. Dewey squatted down to pick up the typewriter and staggered to her feet under its weight. Here, said Charlie. Let me do that. He took it out of her arms and walked easily over to the wagon, which sounded a hollow metal clang when he dropped the typewriter in. Thanks, Dewey said. It's okay. Can you get the rest? We gotta load the boards onto our bikes and get going. Sure. Dewey pulled the knobs off the gray box and carted the rest of her treasures to the wagon intact. She loaded them one by one, writing each down in her notebook, along with the date. The boys were still struggling to balance Jack's bike and tie the lumber to its handlebars. Dewey hesitated for a second, then went over to help. I'll hold the bike, she said. One of you can steady the boards while the other one does the twine. She reached over and took hold of the black leather seat. Yeah, that's much easier, said Charlie after a minute. He added another board, shifting it until it balanced. How's your radio coming? I haven't done much with it, Dewey admitted. During the day, the lab generators and transformers make too much static. It's not much better at night. You've got one up in your treehouse, right? Is the reception any good? Charlie made a face. It was, until the MPs took it last week. Just a little ham setup, but when we broadcast, they tracked down the signal. We weren't saying anything classified. Geez, we didn't even give a location, just call numbers. But you know how it is with the army. We might be Nazi spies, so they snatched it. Do I look like a Nazi spy to you? He kicked his sneaker in the dust. Well, Dewey said, you are kind of blonde. She smiled so that he would know she was kidding. Jack laughed. Anyway, we found another one. He tied a series of half hitches, then tucked the last bit of twine under them. Just a receiver, a big black zenith. It was hard getting it up the ladder. Dewey shrugged. I don't care. Jack took the handlebars and she motioned toward her wagon. I'm going to take this stuff home. Which way are you headed? The treehouse is back behind the Sunts, Jack said, grinning. Way back, kind of on the other side of the fence. He looked over at his brother. Maybe we could show her sometime? Well, Charlie said, drawing the word out as if he was thinking. No girls allowed, usually, but yeah, maybe. He pointed a semi-stern finger at Dewey. You can't tell, though. It's the hill, said Dewey. What can you tell? The boys laughed. You want to stop and get Cokes at the PX? Jack straddled his bike, but gave up on riding it after a few wobbly feet and began to walk it toward the road. Dewey picked up the handle of her wagon and followed him. The Tech PX? Nah, said Charlie, walking his own bike. Too far. Trading post over by the lodge. It's right on the way. Alright, so that is where we are going to stop for today. So we've met a few more characters, right? Some of the kids who live on the hill, and it seems like Dewey is really enjoying herself there. So her and Sue's are going to be kind of our main characters, but we've met a whole bunch of kids, and I can't wait to keep reading with you guys. This is a longer book than most of the ones we've read, so it will take a little bit of building up to get to know the characters, but they're awesome, and I'm excited to keep going. So make sure you stay tuned for tomorrow's video, and we will pick back up with chapter 4, which is called The Motor Pool. All right, see you guys tomorrow. Bye.